Hi, and welcome to this video I put together that touches on some areas that don't often get talked about at the same time, but they should be. And much of my knowledge base came from formal education, but there's a great deal more to learn about how things fit together that you won't get from that. As a young lad, I was always fascinated with biology and physics, all science, and I grew up in the southern U.S. originally, and out of all the places I went later on as well, there's always been one common theme. It's a lack of people asking the big questions about how we are influenced and used, or even realizing those questions exist and should be confronted. Some of us do, of course, but most don't. And to really get to the bottom of why the world is the way it is, so imbalanced and corrupt when it comes to wealth and control, among other things, you can't stay at the surface. You have to suspend everything that might have seemed to be certain and look into the deep nature of how reality works in the first place. I did this drawing to help, hopefully, and these will just be the broad strokes I'll be going through, and it won't be in too technical language. All I'd ask is try to keep an open mind and stick it out to the end. Now I need to go through some fundamentals, especially for those who don't know, because it's important for what we're leading up to. This is the universe by current measurements. Dark matter, dark energy, over 95% of it. No one's sure of what they are, but can tell they're there by what they do. Galaxies and clusters seem to be held together by dark matter. Dark energy is thought to be driving the expansion of the universe. But so far they're transparent and undetectable except through their effects. Now that little wedge is the atomic matter. That's more stars than there are grains of sand on Earth, all the planets there could be, and everything on them, including us on this one. Now you see atoms drawn like this, nucleus and lines to indicate electron orbitals, but these are just representations. An atom looks nothing like this. Both the electrons and nucleus in a drawing would be far too small to see. It would just be blank here. You could enlarge this area to the size of a house, and the nucleus still might not be visible. And electrons have thousands of times less mass than any nucleus. So, how does the world seem solid when it's just all this empty space? Well, there's tremendous amounts of force, energy, and interaction going on. Electrons have a negative charge, and of course, like charges repel, so you don't fall through the ground or you can't walk through a wall because your electrons react with its, and there's an opposing force effect, deflection, if you will. The experience a human has is of solidity and gravity, but at this level, the electromagnetic force of the atom is about 10 to the 36 or a trillion times stronger than gravity, and the nuclear force is far beyond that. And the nucleus, despite how small it is, has basically 100% of an atom's mass. And what exactly is mass? Well, it's something called a quantum chromodynamics binding energy, which is the strong nuclear force holding quarks together as protons and neutrons. Gluons are the force carriers, and quarks move around at nearly the speed of light, so there's the kinetic energy of motion. So the combined QCD energy is basically all of it, and there was a bit left over that the Higgs filled in, of course, and the Higgs field is energy as well, like everything else. So, our normal concepts of solid objects don't apply. And any particle, quarks, bosons, leptons, they can also be described purely as vibrational patterns that translate into what we find around us when we wake up every day. Now, there's obviously a big disconnect in daily life where all these tiny particles are invisible to our five sense experience at the large scale, the macroscopic. But everything large scale is just accumulations of particles. You can't see a single pixel in a screen at a distance, but you can see lots of them working together to make it look like fluid movement across the picture. And when we say I see, touch, smell, taste, or hear, it doesn't actually become that experience until you get to the electrochemical level of neurons that process signals into a specific experience. And what are neuron cells and neurotransmitter molecules made of? These same particles in different kinds of orders. You see, protons, neutrons, electrons, they're like a numerical coding for atoms as these packets of instructions about what will manifest as they accumulate. Water, metal, flesh and bone, it doesn't matter at this level, and the difference is as virtual as it is literal as you scale up to the macroscopic. Lighter atoms like hydrogen, oxygen have 1 to 8 or 10 protons. Heavy atoms like lead, gold, silver, whatever, have 70, 80, but even their nucleuses are tens of thousands of times smaller than the overall atom, and it's over 100,000 for some. So any of them is a huge amount regardless of what atom. And numbers or any kind of differences lose meaning at the point of elementary particles, electrons and quarks. Everything's the same, like points that condense from a source that from the outside looking in appear individuated, but internally they're not. There are quantum fields everywhere that can encompass all the forces, all the known forces in particles, which is incredible to think about. And there are other ways too to tell the story I'll get to later on. So compare one of the simplest molecules, water, it's just 3 atoms, everyone knows that one, to one of the most complex molecules, DNA strand. But looking at it like an instruction set, different strands are just varied orders of the same ingredients. Move the atoms around and the result at macroscopic levels is you get a blue whale, or a hummingbird, or a human. And plants, of course. Epinephrine, adrenaline, it's a hormone and neurotransmitter. Because of a certain way that some hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen are ordered, it does a certain thing. Shuffle them around and it can do something totally different. With stuff like rock and metals, the atoms are ordered in like more uniform sections rather than all these molecular variations where atoms bond into molecules, those into cells, organs, and organism, and you can keep scaling to larger systems, on into the environment, whole planet, whole universe. But at the foundational levels, there is no life or death in the way we think of them separately. It's just different arrangements, movement and change, not life and death. That's what time and evolution are, and what can look like destruction. It's just energy and particles slipping into different arrangements. And the way our thoughts deal with that is organized as the passage of time, to where we feel certain there's a single past already gone by. However, there is no single or certain past in quantum mechanics. The reality we experience is actually through models that the brain uses. When you study the holographic principle in string theory, there's some connections that lead right back to here. Our brain's models are a combination of memories already present and new data that comes in. And however it hits you, if you touch something and it's picked up by nerve endings, or light photons hit the eye, or sound hits the ear, what happens with any of that stimuli is it gets converted to an electrical impulse that is encoded with information, and it travels along the axons between neurons, through the peripheral and central nervous system, and here in the neural activity is where it becomes or fits with the parameters of a reality through our particular lens. If the signals get blocked on their way to traveling to the brain, then you don't get the information and don't have the experience. That's how most anesthetics work. It's why you can be awake with someone cutting on your hand, but if the signal gets stopped before it can travel up your arm, you won't feel anything. It's like flipping the breaker switch to part of the house. And our vision, before it gets there, is like a very pixelated picture due to blind spots where the optic nerves attach. And besides that, visible light is a tiny fraction of what you are looking at. And the brain can subjectively fill in the missing pieces here during the processing to and that extends beyond vision to the other senses as well, to make things appear smooth and fully defined. And the occipital lobe at the back is mainly where sight takes place. And like when you see a tree, what it really means is that photons have scattered, entered the pupil, triggered an impulse, and in neurotransmission, that data gets compared with present data, memory, as being the same or different, and you get a mental picture of what the tree looks like. If you go over and touch it, there's a similar sequence, and touch mainly happens in the parietal lobe. And remember what touch means externally, it's force interaction as one concentration meets another. But the feeling that you undergo takes place between the neurons. And from the different kinds of stimuli, we interpret specific possibilities out of a wide spectrum, vast spectrum that underlies every particle. It's a bit like an antenna only picking up one station while there are countless others around, like different frequencies, all sharing the same space, but just inaccessible to us. And memories are kind of thought to be stored all over, but the temporal lobe, which houses the hippocampus, is the most significant, thought to be anyway. And there's 100 billion neurons, and none of them actually touch each other. They communicate across synapses, gaps between these vein-like dendrites, and the total connections is perhaps 1,000 trillion. And neural activity is a far more powerful processor than any computer, but in a rough sense, you can compare the brain to a computer that's receiving signals through wire or Wi-Fi through radio waves, and then translates enormous amounts of code information into sound and imagery on a screen that we can engage with. A computer is vastly more primitive than what this can do, but it's still the same elementary particles involved and use of electrical communication, and information processing can be looked at as an emergent phenomenon of particles, which is also one way of looking at consciousness. If you think like a physicist, then that may be how you look at it, something in that neighborhood. So the senses aren't really happening in the macroscopic organ itself, the skin, fingertips, the eye, whatever. They happen where the data is read in perceptual models. And remember, we only use a band of wavelengths out of the electromagnetic spectrum that's so narrow it's barely even there, and the same with sound and the rest. So the brain just has some pieces of the puzzle to work with and then builds models around them. We have various tools, instruments, of course, that can detect far beyond our range, but then that input still gets processed and perceived. And when the word evidence comes up, in any case, it means something that is within reach. It's recognizable to the version of reality as we can interpret it to be. Theories get formulated and tested for evidence around that dynamic. You see, science is all about making an observation and then devising explanations through symbols, letters and words, numbers and other mathematical symbols that make predictions and match up with the experience that you and others are having. There's much more to it about what an observation really means, but we'll come back to that. First, what has been observed in the last 100 years of quantum mechanics is that these particles that make up the seemingly concrete world have a nature that goes far beyond anything I talked about over here. Yes, it's more abstract and revealing to talk about everything as energies and forces, but still those are properties that are concrete by comparison. If you take any particle by itself, it can be done with a single electron, an atom, whole molecules, any portion of any substance, if you can isolate it effectively. Particles behave not as little balls of matter at a fixed point, but as a spread out probability wave, a wave function, a vector in a space. But what does it mean? What does that mean beyond just math, the geometry? It's what's really happening to matter in such a state. Well, that's been debated since the beginning and still is today, of course. And there have been different quantum theorists who took quite different approaches, but with the same predictive accuracy. Because of that, for example, the transistor came to be, works properly. So anything that has to do with small, fast computers, including the internet, wouldn't be here otherwise. So a lot of advanced technology is owed to predicting what particles will, and that ability doesn't answer a lot of questions, but they could still use it as a tool. Lots of people have heard of the double slit experiment. It's been done thousands of times, I would think. Some of the most famous ones, the quantum eraser ones, all the delayed choice versions. This one in Vienna in 2013. Well, actually, this one was more famous probably in '99, using these big carbon molecules. This one more recently in 2013, in the same by the same group of scientists, I believe, using these molecules of 810 atoms, which I believe was about 10,000 total hadrons. And something this size isn't far off from the smaller viruses, and it may happen, and fairly soon, that they're able to achieve it with a microorganism. Some would consider a virus to be alive. I would. Photons were the first and are the easiest to do it with. They have lasers now, of course, that can pulse one photon at a time. As you get into these big particles, it gets extremely difficult just to construct the experiment. But they keep pushing it further. It's hard to express what happens when particles are in a wave or a superposition of many states. The word abstract doesn't begin to suffice. A single particle can form these interference patterns. See, like if there were 2 points in water, here and here, or here and here, they make patterns like these, with peaks developing where the crests meet. With everyday objects, what we call billiard ball physics, a particle should go straight from one point to another on one path, and it does sometimes when it's being detected. Then the particle does behave like a little pool ball. But if it's not being detected, then it seems to open out and take an enormous number of paths, and all simultaneously. And that means not just paths that curve and search around in the vicinity, but paths that could go across the universe and back. So this kind of behavior annihilates all the kinds of time and tangible constraints that we're used to. The actions of entanglement, of course, breaks the law of faster than light effects. It's instantaneous at any distance. And it's harder for some than others, especially at the start, to let go of everything familiar to appreciate these things. And it's important to emphasize that they're just as valid as what is familiar. As fields, as waves, it can seem that particles in their primal form are really just a spectrum of potentials. They're everywhere and nowhere exact and all at once. It's more like an idea than an object. It's like when you're trying to make a decision and there are many choices spread out, and some are more likely than others, but their numbers radiate perhaps to infinity with at least a slight chance, no matter how far it goes. And there's been lots of different thoughts about what's happening, and lots of disagreement too. And I actually get amused by it sometimes. And of course, it's been the grand struggle to link the quantum with macroscopic behavior, relativity. And yet, while we perceive this huge divide between the two, and there is when you look straight from one extreme to the other. However, when you start trying to draw absolute lines between them, there are no absolute lines, just approximations about where one ends and the other begins. They blend each into the other, though it may appear like two opposite worlds that do begin and end. And there are gray areas everywhere, of all kinds. Things aren't determined with certainties but probabilities. There's a randomness, a wild card effect aspect that's ever present, and there's the uncertainty principle, of course, that you can't find all the quantities of something at once, like a speed and position. One gets lost to get the other, and it shouldn't imply that there was just one of the other, but a superposition of many. The meaning is dramatically different with the very small. To skip straight to the large, the effect is so slight it's next to unnoticeable. But as far as absolutes go, you can never know everything for sure, just a perspective, your perspective. I would say I'm still moving 0 miles an hour right now. But if someone could see the situation from far enough away, they'd redefine that to over 1,000,000 miles an hour as the galaxy moves through the universe with this star contained within it. And I should age slower than them, of course, if they stayed still behind the galaxy, since faster moving clocks tick slower relative to them, that is. For each of us individually, time would still seem the same speed. So, perception is fundamental to everything, both micro and macroscopic, and different perceptions can be correct at the same time. Decoherence is when a particle is surrounded by others and kind of disrupt its state. Then you're able to know where it is as part of something that's available to the senses. You have a form of measurement, some data, and it's likely to be consistent with the world as you've observed prior. When they're not being disrupted somehow, particles are in this state as a distributed wave, and it's not just size alone that makes the difference, that reveals the superposition, but the unavailability of knowing where they are. It's having no sensory input of any kind. You can't see it nor touch it, and so on. But I'm not out to try to say what exactly collapses the wave. There's another approach without viewing such separators between states in the first place. While some of these molecules are, millions of times bigger than a proton, still any of these particles are extremely small, and of course you can't tell where they are without some special equipment to tell you where they are, what they're doing, to detect them. And that would be akin to the decoherence when they're surrounded by others in larger everyday structures that you have a track on. Once they get involved with somehow by any mechanism of detection, and then that data hits a sensory organ and goes to the brain and gets processed, from there on they show up as a particle and follow billiard ball physics. Often when there's talk about measuring, observing, it's accompanied by the tone that we're in an objective reality that's 100%, not 50, not 99, but completely divisible from the abstractions of the mind. The majority just agree on some of them, though, is a better way to put it than using any percentage. The cutting edge and perhaps greatest frontier of science, probing into this neural network, suggests that we experience through models and interpretations, and that the senses and what measurements really are happen here at this level in a very complex synthesis of ways that aren't fully understood yet. In any scenario, when the input is there to work with, matter resolves from a vast spectrum of possibility to what we take as one. And that transition is somewhere between the influx of raw, unprocessed, unfiltered data and what degree of it the brain is able to process into a finished product that it projects to us. That's what I mean by a version of reality, because what we derive is not the mirror image of all that's out there. And it's perfectly valid to view consciousness as an emergent quality of physical particles, but quantum behavior has shown that particles only fit our classical definition of physical while we have them located somewhere by an involvement. any mechanism of detection that that then links to sight, sound, and the rest, or any mixture. It's another of the pivot points to think about, the availability or unavailability of information. The eraser experiments help show there's more than just the cause of photons from detectors changing the nature of waves. It's any record period. Part of the setup is done without any detector there, but the behavior still depends on whether the which path record that gets taken below from the twin particle is available. If it gets erased, then there's a wave pattern. If it gets recorded and saved, then there's a particle pattern. It's about the keeping track or losing track of what happened. In the delayed choice experiments, you decide whether to keep track or not after the wave has already passed through the slits, and if you do, then it goes back in time and acts as a particle. There is no definite past, you see. It's an open door of possibilities like the future, and decisions made present can alter the past. Particles can have no single history in order to account for this kind of freedom in between our measurements when all possibilities are in play and simultaneously. Time seems to be one straight path in the way our brains organize events to try to make sense of things, and our universe has what you could label a single history in these particles, but it's just one potential of many, and it's what's called a probability amplitude, the one that we're most likely to find when we're looking. There's been more speculation than ever that we're living in a virtual reality, and it could be. But it could also just be that nature at its deep levels operates in ways that you'd expect of a simulation. And I think more and more serious scientists have started to consider it from that angle, whereas a few decades ago that was almost unheard of. But there was already talk about it as long as 50, 60 years ago by some who were way ahead of their time. And there's just so many theories out there that stemmed from these kind of mind-boggling physics and trying to connect it with the familiar everyday. There's the many worlds interpretation. Pretty much everyone's heard of Erwin Schrödinger. He developed his landmark wave equations in the 1920s, but he's probably more of a household name because of the infamous cat paradox, where it's simultaneously deceased and alive, and that would apply to any organism, of course, including a person, if their state was tangled up with a superposed quantum state. Then the thinking can extend further to every event that's ever happened, which had alternatives that would have split into other realities, so the numbers would be so big it might as well be infinite. And the lean nowadays seems to be more towards the many worlds take on the quantum than any other. String theory, M theory, or a theory of everything. I mentioned earlier how weak gravity is compared to the other forces. It's been a problem for a long time. Gravity doesn't really come in until there's at least some accumulation of particles. It could even be called an emergent quality itself, of them being located among others and are participating in the environment. But this is a quantum theory that includes gravity, and it translates this behavior of alternate paths, alternate histories, over to universes with gravity like this one. And to do that, extra dimensions are needed, folded together, kind of like this. Everyone's seen this shape, or something similar to it, at very small scales, of course, in order to account for these quantum fluctuations and then translate them over to macroscopic situations. Think of time as a sphere. And you can start at any one point, go outwards, and see space-time spreading and evolving, and in our frame of reference it seems to have had a beginning, but you could have just as likely started at any other point on the sphere and spread out from there as well. The sort of trajectories of the quantum tells that time and space are so different by comparison, and you have to factor that in where our universe would have been compressed into this tiny point, what they coined the Big Bang. And string theory is a way to go beyond that. In our dealings with the large, there is this, we find this one universe that shows an evolution with a start at one point. However, the quantum is as valid of a qualifier to what's real, if not more, because that's the building blocks behind everything. And strings sometimes get depicted like the pulsations of different musical notes. It's kind of a poetic way to put it. It's interesting. And as the extraordinary math was worked out over several decades by many different contributors, I believe it began back in the 70s, in the very early onset. But by the time all the alternate histories have been accounted for, and a lot of those who have made it their life's work say it takes at least 10 to the 500, probably more, other universes, and they can repeat as well. And that number it's not an infinity, but it is enormous. There's only supposed to be about 10 to the 80 atoms in this universe. That's the atoms that would be in an average star times a few hundred billion per galaxy times, say, 100 billion galaxies. If it's 10 to the 80, then the atoms in a trillion universes like this is only, 10 to the 92? And of those 10 to the 500 other universes, some should be similar, even identical to ours, but some of them could be so different, there may be no comprehension we can have about what they'd be like. So, where exactly are all these other possible realities of string theory? Where are all the other possible realities of the many worlds interpretation? Well, they'd be right here, all around us all the time, as wave functions. We just don't know how to access them as a manifestation. Or our universe may very well be a hologram. That's what the behavior of black holes would suggest, and when you look around at some of the other extremes of nature, it seems rather in line that it could all be holographic. There's a phenomenon in science where different theories can accurately describe the same thing. So which one is more right than the others? Well, whose place is it to say? And that includes attitudes about evidence and why our ability to recognize should be assumed definitive. However many details you accumulate, there should still be a humbleness and an openness to new ideas. If anyone says they've got it all figured out, well, that's the first clue that they probably don't. None of the most brilliant individuals I learned from ever made such a claim. But I have heard it before, a lot actually. And those are the type who usually think only their beliefs are right and all the others are wrong, and the others may be thinking the same thing. Usually how that works. Let's see. Where do I want to go from here? The debate about consciousness has just gotten more elaborate as time's gone on, as far as what creates it, where it comes from. Is it not created but already there everywhere as a potentiality of nature and you're just tuned into a small portion? Or is it emergent of an area of matter that only macroscopically looks contained, isolated? And whether it's scientists or philosophers, there's two sides that get argued about, material and non-material. Well, what about turning to the theme that tends to get overlooked about how there are no absolute lines between things. There's general areas where things are close and are just called a divide point, but if you investigate those points closer, you instead find overlap, and you can't absolutely separate them. There are no perfect boundaries. Thermodynamics and the course of energy's motion and transformation between what can appear as extremely different states is an example. It's still energy, not dying and being reborn, but just altering. Electrical activity, of course, is a form of energy, including that which flows through the brain. And when an energy ceases to be somewhere, it's not that it's destroyed or sources for it have disappeared as you trace back either. It's all about relocation and alteration. And it's so easy to make analogies to what we see and do every day. If you go for a walk, you're not destroying energy. It's being moved out through heat and a vibrational imprint that's left in the atoms of the ground under your shoes and in the air. They're left kind of jiggling more than they were. Or think about the caterpillar and butterfly, or water going from ice to vapor. That's all the same parts, just moved into different orders, but seems so diverse. The same elementary particles in the universe billions of years ago are the same ones here now, and that's just if you look at them as this objective structure. There's lots of other perspectives. Now, some mean consciousness as just being awake. You're not asleep or knocked out. And then there's being self-aware. And the second meaning is usually called the hard problem of consciousness because it's harder to explain physiologically. Almost everyone comes at it from way too much of a black and white angle, though. On one level, particles in certain arrangements that form a nervous system and conversion from particles of sustenance can be cited as the fuel and a seedbed for individual consciousness. But then go deeper into the nature of particles and energy, which is what they are too, internally. And keep going. When you break things down way past the elementary level to the string level, what could be called the string field or the unified field. And there's something that words can't even capture. I can't capture it. It's something going deeper than any vibration, any frequency. There's no separation. There's one universal pool of interconnection and essentially limitless potential. And as for material, non-material, it erases any argument about lines between. Because on this level, they're part of the same ocean. And when it's said that we are all one, that's true when you search far enough. Physicality, the classical definition, is another model. It's a way to have an experience. There's links between neural processing of input from sources that are a wave function when not being processed and then resolved to a vibrating point as part of the model, the virtual experience when they are. And using the word virtual doesn't have to mean unreal. It's just a descriptive quality. Vice versa, from another angle, there's links between those resolved points and emergent phenomena. In most outlooks, we have it worked out to where there's a great divide between material and non-material, rather than as different expressions of the same thing. Having particles located, among others, that will synchronize with the rest of the environment as it's modeled and your place in it, that effect applies from the particles of distant galaxies when we see them in a telescope, all the way to the particles in your head of the neural network itself, neurotransmitters and ions that carry signals. And as you keep refining the brain too, down below specific forms, what's left is just the pure potential that takes different forms. And the question always comes up, does consciousness collapse the wave, as if they're separate? But it's not a black and white yes or no kind of question. It's just commonly presented that way. Well, the video's starting to run long, so I'm going to make somewhat of a shift now. What I've talked about so far has been to share a view on the amazing inner clockwork of reality and hopefully open up a sense of what is possible and how it would happen. Because when you start talking about mass brainwashing, I think it isn't truly effective without some background into all this. And then describing how to break free of it isn't either. There's no shortage of ways to tell about trend lines of wealth transfer from the many up to the few. We all know about it. It's no secret. This is from Forbes. Either column by itself doesn't tell the story. It's that the left number jumps by about 3.8 times, the other one about twice as much. And this trend goes back in time long before this, but it gets very dramatic during these years for this top fraction of the 1%, and for the rest of the 1% to some degree on other graphs, but in stark contrast to everyone else. I shouldn't have to tell anyone by now that war is just business. It means manufacturing, resource takeover, and all kinds of opportunities that funnel up to the same super wealthy who own Wall Street, banking, pharmaceuticals, and everything else. They have every profitable reason to engineer a war, just like their other big businesses that are structured with the first priority being to speed up the transfer as fast as they can get away with. Now, I'm not saying that 100% of the super wealthy are stone cold evil. That's unfair. There's exceptions. But to think the overall state of things is this way because they're all just kind and honest, well, that's a wall of denial. And it's almost as bad to think the masses have zero blame for letting them get away with it. I don't have everything figured out either. But what I have done is stop cooperating with the system, this machine that it is, and doing what they wanted me to in support of their game. And it is a rigged game. Much of the public can tell what's going on, I think, with at least some idea of how deceptive and crooked it is. But they often feel powerless. They say, what could I have done about it? They've had their hands full working 50 hours a week for the machine just to have a roof to sleep under, and it's set up that way by design to keep us misdirected, feeling obligated to go, and divert attention away from what goes on behind the curtain. And almost every last detail of how societies has been shaped, going way back, has this gradual transfer somewhere in the strategy. There's a vast interplay between all the financial deceit and media, and there's so many different facets to it. But what's really important right here, right now, is to be able to look past surface events. Mainstream education, to the biggest degree manageable, is set up to instruct how to best serve the machine, but not to be able to read between the lines of exactly how it funnels the results of labor. And they teach this memorize and repeat without question pattern of actions and an overall sense of what are your available options, what are the parameters of what's real and you should trust, what you are and should only identify with their instructions about it. And that sense gets reinforced nonstop by other influences, media of course being a big part of it. What's the biggest key though is not so much what kind of information that is thrown at you constantly from all sides, but how you're going to perceive it. Above all, those with this machine-like agenda want to get at us early and hard to fine-tune the initial conditions about how interpretation will operate lifelong, because on down the road it won't matter what kind of distortions are being pushed if you aren't predisposed to accept and to be in the kind of a reality that allows them to operate. And it goes so far to the very core of being resigned to such limited circumstances here in a body on a rock in space with no more to identify with, so that we'll feel small and compelled to just give in and do what they say. And they have they've always had an understanding, at least by instinct, of all the subjects I brought up earlier and how to exploit it to a monumental advantage. They understand how to hardwire perceptions and do it so well that they can then insist they do no such thing and often be believed. They need us under pressure in survival mode, thinking in terms of division, off and on, life and death, and keeping a spotlight only on appearances. It all helps to drive in their guidelines as the summit of all there is to be aware of, so we'll look no further. They're able to convince the masses to serve them in just the desired way, with most of us clueless about how it's done, that it even could be done. We get pushed to focus on what puts us at odds, compete, and which leads to all this greed, conflict, and distance. It's the divide and rule tactic, to boil it all down, and it works really well for those at the top who reap the profits. But they're not all powerful, and they're not all knowing either, because ultimately it's an illusion that using and abusing others for their benefit will work out in the really big picture, because they're ultimately just doing it to themselves. I left part of the page blank there on the side because there's so much that still isn't known by anyone, and there's been a lack of combining diverse areas together out of what is known. That's challenging, but to have a revolution, it'll take a revolutionary method, and I hope that more research goes that way with more collaboration, and whole new sciences could even develop, or just new ways of looking at them. And as complicated as it may get, the answers that come to light someday may have a beautiful simplicity. The root solution to the imbalance of humanity is first a change of awareness. Nothing else will change otherwise. That's already been said before in different ways by lots of others going back in history. Usually they either got disregarded or assassinated. Those at the top don't want to create martyrs, though. If possible, that validates the cause. The much preferred outcome is to simply discredit and try to pass them off as crazy or uninformed, so they'll just be ignored for the most part. There's always been a scattering of people out there who don't even need to be told the solution. They know through their own insight that survived in spite of all the attempts to drown it out. And when you can get outside the box and find a state of thought without all these appearances that are so distracting, you don't even feel worry anymore. There's no fear of anything or need for approval. You can see the distortions for what they are, which incredibly so many are still believing in and supporting. But there is some sign lately, I think, that the number has decreased. Consciousness doesn't have a range nor a ceiling that is carved in stone, and it isn't just aware and unaware. There are many subtle levels that go down and that go up. And how far? Well, to me, the connectivity of all things is clear, and in all likelihood, the universe, quantum multiverse, by whatever name, is infinite. Imagine how different the world would be automatically if the experience of all being one could even slightly balance into this experience. And that will have to be eventually, because it's just another illusion that the two are separate to begin with. Well, I appreciate anyone who listened this far. There's so much more I could say, but that was what I most wanted to put out there. And I have a written piece I did as well that's it's very similar to this, but has some additional thoughts. I'll put a link at the bottom if you care to read it. And I'll show you some of my paintings here. I don't sell these. I just do it when I feel inspired. They're acrylic. Obviously, physics, chemistry, pretty much all the things I used to study play a part, and kind of my own take on it. Never work with oils, just acrylic. One more. Alright, well, I'm going to say farewell then, and take care.